let me step you through 7 steps that I take in drawing trees. Now, this really is an easy tree drawing, I think. It may look complex because there are lots of marks on the paper, but that's not the same as being something that's very difficult and complex to draw. Sometimes the simplest forms are really difficult to draw to have them look accurate, because there's no room to make any mistake or have any mark the slightest bit out of place. So while there certainly are challenges in drawing trees, there is a lot of forgiveness as well overall. But these things, these 7 points, will help you to not cross that line with the things where a tree is inherently forgiving and ones where things that we might do unhelpfully might still spoil our final drawing. My first step is always start with the foliage. Most people seem to want to start with the trunk at ground level and go up. And in my experience of what I've drawn and what I've seen, it's very hard to get the overall scale of the tree accurate in that way. Almost invariably, the trunk goes too high, is too wide, and there's simply not enough room to put the amount of foliage that's needed by a trunk or trunks and branches that large. So this is overcome if we establish the foliage or most of the foliage first. And it means we can position the foliage in the place where we want it in the drawing. So it doesn't have to be compressed at the top or run off the page. I think it's very helpful at the start to put a dot on the paper where we think the trunk may hit the ground. Now, depending how we've positioned this on the page, there may be a bit of flexibility there. But we're not trying to draw the trunk yet, just the foliage. And I like to start somewhere in the center of the foliage and work out in 360 degrees all around it. I find if I do that and I start getting a little inaccurate, I start to change the scale and start to draw it a little bit smaller or larger as I move out, that if I start in the middle, I can only get halfway with that distortion because I have the other half where I can draw it in a way to balance it once I realize what I've done. And it's the same with going up and coming down. It just gives a little more flexibility to our not being 100% precise in our proportions of the canopy. And certainly it's easy to get lost in drawing tree canopies. So that's the second point. Start in the center of the canopy. Third point is be really light and gentle and delicate with the silhouette edges. Now, I'm drawing this with a 0.3mm pen, which is probably a darker pen than I would use. I probably would have used a 0.2 if I were drawing this for myself, but I wanted the dark areas to come up nice and dark on the camera for this video. So I'm using a slightly heavier pen. So with these silhouette edges, the tops of the tree canopy that we can see against the sky in particular, I want to do the lightest marks I can. Now, the fourth point is we need to try and capture the visual appearance of the tree. Every tree looks different. It depends on what sort of tree, depends on how the leaves hang on the branches, how the leaves are clumped together on the branches, how close the branches are to each other, whether there's one whole canopy that we can't see through or whether there's clumps that we can see through. And it also depends on the distance we are from the tree. The other thing I want to do is, if it's the case as it is here, where the closest leaves that I have are sort of in the center of the canopy ball, that means that the silhouette leaves are further away than the closest ones. So I want to also give them a lighter touch with my mark making so that it feels a little bit further away than the leaves that are closest. Otherwise, our canopy ball can look like a cutout shape stuck on the paper. And if we're going for reality, that's not what we want. So I'm trying to capture the visual appearance of the canopy. And that almost certainly means, unless we're very close and the leaves are very large, that we try not to draw individual leaves. Because if I do, that will give the impression that will almost certainly be too large for the tree. And that will change the perception of the scale, of the size of the tree. It will, in effect, mostly make the trees look a lot smaller if we think we can see the leaves that close up. And so when I'm doing my silhouettes, I'm particularly working hard to not make marks that suggest a leaf unless it's an appropriate size mark for a leaf, for that tree, for that distance. Now, the fifth point I think we can see happening fairly strongly at this point, and that's try not to see the leaves when we're doing the canopy, but see the values, see the darknesses. And you might have noticed that when I began the canopy, I was actually beginning as much by blocking out the dark areas. If we look at this reference photo and I up the contrast a little to darken the dark areas more, we can see that there's like a wave, a rippled wave from left to right, arcing through the canopy. And I want to try and draw that. And I'm not going to draw it with lines. I'm going to draw it with hatching, cross-hatching, to create the darkness. The other thing then is there are some parts of this canopy that are in really very strong light, catching the light quite strongly. But there's also a lot of areas that aren't really, really dark, but they're not the brightest. They're not catching the light completely. There's some element of shade which is reducing the darkness. And if we were to desaturate the photo, if we had a digital copy of this, we could take the color out and see exactly the range of grays we have between the very darkest and the very lightest parts of the canopy. So I want to hatch in a way to create the same pattern of lights and darks with the same sort of silhouette edge where there's a really strong transition from light to dark, as we have usually at the bottom particularly of those dark waving areas. And the way I find it's best is to actually do the darkest lines, the darkest areas, the darkest patches first, the ones that are clearly virtually black, and then work out which areas are going to be really very light. So I don't want to put too many lines on the paper because I'm drawing directly in ink, so once a mark's there I can't erase it. So I want to make sure I preserve the paper to the degree I need to for the effect I want. And so then with my two extremes in place, I slowly start to hatch the darker areas of the mid-range of values and then increase that overall till I push the lightest areas of hatching right up against the lightest areas, and I keep going over the darker mid values as I do this so that I take them closer to the darkest values that I have, to the really dark ones. So this is something which really doesn't take much practice to start to become quite proficient at it, as long as we're very focused on what we're doing. And while we don't have to do the values of the canopy exactly the same as in the reference, in my experience, nature comes up with far more interesting, varied, very effective forms than the average artist does. And so I find that if I try to copy as closely as I can what nature's presenting me in my reference, which is often why I want to draw it in the first place, because I think it's a stunning canopy, I find that given the slight variations that at best I will still create, I'm getting an overall far better, far more realistic looking canopy than if I just tried to do it myself. The sixth point is make sure that position mark on the ground is there. And then the seventh point is the one that I've just been doing now in the reference, and that's the tree trunks. Now, do not draw straight continuous lines from the canopy to the ground. That is very, very rarely a helpful mark to make. It just starts to create a cartoon-like effect, which is a shame if we've captured a nice degree of realism in our canopy. And you'll notice I did the hatching in a different direction to the lines of the canopy, and that helps to both emphasize the cylindrical nature of the trunks and the branches, but also simply to visually separate those from the trees, from the canopy, from the leaves, the foliage, which is important when they're both of a similar value. Another thing I find very helpful, particularly when the trunks are more silhouetted than they are in this drawing, is to do a series of short lines that meet in whatever way the bark pattern is. so that I'm starting to create the silhouette of the bark. And it simply depends whether it's a very smooth tree with very smooth thin bark that peels off, or whether the bark is thick and chunky and crusty. It's like 2 inches thick, and there's big deep grooves in between the chunks of bark that at different times of the year fall off in chunks, in thick heavy pieces. So again, it's the same as we do in the foliage. We try and reflect the form and the composition in our silhouette marks. And now I'm just adding a little bit of shadow and on the grass. Now, this tree has been heavily pruned year after year because there are high tension wires above it. So it should never have been planted in this spot. It once had a thick trunk and it was cut off at ground level. So now it's sprouted in 360 degrees around the outside edge of the stump, and it's doing its best to survive. So that does affect the form a bit. It is an artificially sculpted tree, and these trees are actually enormous, and they're Australian turpentines from where we get terps, and they tend to explode in bushfires. So I'm not sure why they're a street planting in this spot, but when I came across it, I thought it was a really interesting shape. It was a bit hard to work out where the canopy finished on the lower right-hand side, and in a moment, when I finish this, you'll see that having screwed up my eyes and looked at it hard, I thought there's probably some more coming out, and so I added that. Whether it's part of this tree or a tree that's mostly off camera to the right, I'm not sure, but I thought it would make it just a more nicely balanced canopy anyway. And in the end, it's my drawing that matters. My reference is my starting point. I'm not a slave to it. I'm not copying the photo. I've already got the photo. I can't draw a better photo than the photo. So I'm trying to create something that is not in the photo, but use the photo as my starting point. And so I'm just finishing now these extra bits in the canopy, but I'm employing all the thinking that I've outlined in those first points about edges and values, and going for the darker areas, very light touch. And I think that adds a nicer balance. What we want to do is make sure we don't fill in all the gaps on the canopy and end up with a relatively round, smooth edge, because that doesn't reflect the reference. That's a great way to do it if that's what it's like in life. But so often we simply don't have the self-control to keep observing carefully, and we just keep putting marks on the paper, and then of course we can't get them off. This small shrub that's at the base, I've drawn that a bit large. It's a bit out of scale, but otherwise I'm happy with this. You'll find this reference, of course, on my channel community page if you want to have a go drawing this particular tree with these 7 points in mind. And why not hit the like button for me if you made it till here? And also, I'd love to hear of your experience if you have a go drawing this yourself in the comments. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I love drawing trees. They are not as hard as people think if we think of them and approach them in our mindset the right way when we draw them. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.